So good evening, and we'd like to thank you all for being with us tonight, and we're very delighted to see the overwhelming interest in learning more about the latest research in brain health. So just to introduce myself, my name is Ruth Slack, and I'm the director of the University of Ottawa Brain and Mind Research Institute. And just before we get started, I'd like to introduce the Brain and Mind team who worked tirelessly to put on the event for the entire week. So I'd like to introduce Natasha Hollywood, our program manager, Victoria Rache, our communications coordinator, and Candace Fortier, our administrative coordinator. And on behalf of the entire team, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you tonight. So as we all know, this year is very different from past years when we held Brain Health Awareness Week. Normally we're in the amphitheater, and then we have a social event where you have the opportunity to meet the speakers, meet the trainees, and ask more questions. But unfortunately now we're in the middle of a pandemic. And this year, all of our events for the entire week will be held virtually, because we want to be sure that everyone stays safe. But there's one thing, or if there's a number of things that the pandemic has taught us, one thing is that medical research is critically important. We can't wait for a healthcare crisis. We need to keep up the momentum for medical research. The other thing the pandemic has taught us, it is that there's a critical need to stay connected with each other, with our community, and really provide a supportive environment. So the Brain and Mind will continue to reach out to the community and provide events and programs throughout the fall and the winter sessions. So tonight is the opening night of Brain Health Awareness Week. And the objective is to raise awareness about brain health, but also to update you on the latest research that's happening right here at the University of Ottawa Brain and Mind Research Institute. And our approach is to bring together the top researchers from across the entire city of Ottawa, including the 5 affiliated hospitals, multiple faculties across the city, to focus on understanding and developing new treatments for devastating neurological disorders. So to kick off Brain Health Awareness Week, we're delighted to present a short opening video from Mayor Jim Watson, who you all know very well, and who also has a very long-standing commitment to healthcare and to healthy living. So now let's listen to what Mayor Watson has to say as he proclaims Brain Health Awareness Week here in Ottawa.
Ottawa, brain and mind-related illnesses affect 1 in 3 Canadians of any age, the impacts of which are enormous in Canada and worldwide. And I'm proud that Ottawa, led by the University of Ottawa Brain and Mind Research Institute and their international leaders in brain health, are furthering groundbreaking and innovative research. Brain Health Awareness Week empowers our community to learn more about healthy aging and how they can lead a healthy lifestyle. Therefore, I, Jim Watson, Mayor of the City of Ottawa, do hereby proclaim October 19th to October 23rd, 2020 as Brain Health Awareness Week in Ottawa, and call upon all citizens to mind their brain. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
So we thank Mayor Jim Watson for all your support, and we also thank the mayor and the entire team at the City of Ottawa for their tireless work right now in such challenging times. So now we'll begin with our programming for tonight. Tonight's session is focused on how can we keep our brain and our memory sharp throughout the lifespan. And you will hear from experts who work on memory and cognition, dementia treatment, and also dementia prevention, including Doctors Nafissa Ismail, Neil Thomas, and Antoine Hakim. So it's a pleasure to start off and introduce the first speaker for tonight, Dr. Nafissa Ismail. Dr. Ismail is a professor in the Faculty of Social Sciences in the Department of Psychology. She is an expert in memory and cognition, and she's been on the news several times to discuss the effects of COVID-19 on stress and mental health. She's also received numerous awards, such as the University of Ottawa Young Researcher Award of Excellence. And today she will talk about how memories are made in the brain, how they're stored, and how they're retrieved. So thank you, Dr. Ismail.
Thank you, Ruth, for the generous introduction. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining our event. I'm honored to be here and to talk to you about how memories are formed, how and where memories are stored in the brain, and discuss how our fundamental understanding of cognition can help guide clinical research into memory loss and memory-related disorders. So first, what is memory? Well, before we understand memory, we first need to understand learning. And learning is essentially a relatively permanent change in behavior that results from some type of experience with our environment. So as we engage with our environment, we hear things, we see things, and that impacts us and changes our behavior permanently. And then learning is essentially, memory is essentially learning that persists over time. So it's information that has been acquired and stored and can be retrieved when we need it later on. But first, let me start by telling you how impressive your memory is. If I showed you 2,500 different faces for 10 seconds each, and later showed you 280 of these faces, along with some faces that you've never seen, you would be able to recognize the faces that you saw previously within 90% accuracy. Pretty impressive, right? And humans are not the only ones that have good memory for faces. Other animals do too. Take sheep, for example. You can take sheep and show them different sheep faces and pair food rewards with some faces and not with others. And you will see that 2 years later, the sheep will still remember the face that were associated with food reward. But of course, memory for faces is just an example. And there are other important types of memory that we also need to investigate. But the important point here is that animals can be used to understand these basic processes to then be able to better understand the more complex cognitive activities that humans engage in. But why am I telling you about animals? Well, that's because a lot of what we know about learning and memory comes from animals. Animal research allows us to better understand certain physiological processes. We can control their environment, control their learning history. We can control the genetic makeup and see what the role of the genes are in learning and memory formation versus the role of the environment. So really, animals allow us to have control over the learning in ways that we cannot with humans. Plus, since the fundamental mechanisms that underlie learning and behavior are very similar across all animals, we can extrapolate findings from animal research to humans with a certain caution, of course. But most of the knowledge on learning and memory comes from rats and mice. But it is an important question right now to understand how do we accomplish such memory feats. So how does all this occur in our brain? How does memory work? How do we extract information from our environment and then store it and retrieve it later as we need it again? So I guess the fundamental question that is in our mind right now is how are memories formed? It all starts at the level of our senses, where our sensory organs, such as our eyes, ears, hands, nose, etc., will receive input from various stimuli in our environment. All this information enters our sensory information, our sensory memory, where the information here will last less than 1 second. So a lot of information comes into our sensory memory, but we're not really aware of it. However, there are some of this information that are more salient than others, and those will catch our attention. When they do catch our attention, these elements of information are then transferred onto our short-term memory, where the information here will last for less than a minute. Now, if this is information that is important to us, if we're thinking about it, if we're rehearsing that information, then our short-term memory is going to qualify this information as being important information that we may need to access later on. And then it's going to transfer this information onto our long-term memory, where here the information can last a lifetime. There is no limit to the amount of time that the information can remain in our long-term memory. And for a long time, we used to see the short-term memory as being just a memory that allows us to store information for a short period of time. But we also know that when we are looking for information in our memory, it is the short-term memory that is going to go and retrieve the information from our long-term memory. And so psychologists in general prefer calling the short-term memory working memory to kind of show that it is an active memory process. And it's not just passively storing information for less than a minute. It can also work with that information. It can retrieve that information when we need it. But now I am sure one burning question that is in your mind right now is, where is this information stored in our brain? Well, when you look at an active brain, you see that it looks like an immense network of electrical wires. As you zoom into it, you will see that it is made of 100 billion neurons that are interconnected and allow communications between various brain regions. Memory is a complex system involving multiple structures and brain regions, and memory is formed and processed and stored really throughout the brain. And different types of memories will activate different connection, different pathways within the brain. But there is not one single region in which we can say this is where memory is formed. It's really throughout the brain. So how is information embedded now in the brain? Well, it is embedded through a process that is not completely clear to researchers, but we know that it is through neuroplasticity. And what it is, neuroplasticity, it's essentially the formation of new neurons, new neuronal connections or synapses, as we call them in neuroscience, changes at the level of biochemical signaling within the brain. And all that is what will support new learning, new memory formation. Now, in continuing to investigate and understand neuroplasticity more, we have identified a number of factors that we know are going to impact neuroplasticity. And I've listed some here, but Dr. Hakim is going to go into these in more details and more. But some of the factors that have been identified as impacting neuroplasticity are stress, physical exercise, sleep, social interaction, nutrition, etc. I would like to bring your attention towards nutrition. So why do we think that nutrition is important or impacting neuroplasticity? Well, friends, nutrition impacts neuroplasticity through our gut microbiota. The gut microbiome consists of all the microorganisms like bacteria, viruses, protozoa, fungi, and all their collective genetic material present in our gastrointestinal tract. The gut microbiome plays an important role in both the maintenance of health, but also in the pathogenesis of diseases. So our diet can cause changes at the level of the composition of our gut microbiota, and this can then impact our brain. and it impacts our brain through the gut-brain axis, which is a bidirectional communication between our brain and our gut. So with that, I would tell you, dear friends, make good choices of what you eat, feed your brain well, and thank you for your time.
So thank you very much, Dr. Ismail, for a great talk. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions, but we're going to hold the questions for our speakers till the end of the session, where we'll have our panel discussion. So now I would like to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Neil Thomas, who is a cognitive neurologist at the Briere Memory Program and an investigator with the Briere Research Institute. And he is also affiliated with the University of Ottawa Brain and Mind Research Institute. His research is focused on looking at new technology for the early detection of dementia and cognitive impairment. So thank you for being with us today, Dr. Thomas.
All right. Okay, so well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today, and I'm also very honored to have this opportunity. So my name is Dr. Neil Thomas, and as Dr. Slack said, I'm a neurologist at the Brain and Memory Program and a researcher at the University of Ottawa, the Mind and Brain Institute, and the Briere Research Institute. So I'm going to be talking today about the differences between changes in memory and thinking in normal aging versus dementia, how we diagnose dementia in the clinic, and some research into using new methods, using technology to detect changes in memory and thinking. So what is normal aging versus cognitive impairment? So unfortunately, memory and thinking do slow down somewhat as we age, but different aspects of memory change somewhat differently. So when we look at different aspects of cognition, we can break them down into crystallized intelligence, and this is something that refers more to our skills, abilities, knowledge that's overlearned, well practiced, and it's familiar. So that's like our vocabulary, our general fund of knowledge. So sort of what this cartoon is alluding to, all those things that build up in our brain and we can pull out later on, and that general knowledge that we accumulate through life. And it generally is stable, or it improves a little bit with age because we keep learning as we get older. Now, fluid intelligence, that's the thing that changes more as we age, and that is referring to the abilities involving more things like problem solving, reasoning, but things that are less familiar, and these are independent of what we've learned, and so multitasking and things like that. When we are looking more specifically at changes in memory, right here, this outlines a bit of those aspects that stay stable versus those that decline with age. So things that decline with age are things such as delayed free recall. So that's trying to remember something spontaneously without a cue. So, if we tried to go to the grocery store and pick up 5 items, that might get a bit harder as we're older. But our ability to retrieve information when given a cue, such as remembering something from a story we were told, if someone was giving you a bit of a cue to remember, yes or no questions. And that falls a little bit with what Dr. Ismail was talking about with, if you're given a cue, it helps with the retrieval of a memory that's been encoded. So it's there, you just need a little help getting it out when you're a bit older. Source memory, that generally is referring to, knowing exactly where we learned something. So did you learn that fact on the news, or did you hear it on the radio? And you might not be able to do that as well as you get older, but remembering the correct time and the sequence of events is generally preserved. So you'll remember what you did last weekend versus last month, if it's an important event. And then things like perspective memory. So that's remembering, actions that we're supposed to do coming up. And that's things like taking medications. So that can be a bit slower as we get older, or you might forget every now and then. But procedural memory, so that's memory of how we actually do things, learn skills such as riding a bike. And that's something that shouldn't change with age. But it'll be interesting to see now that we have sort of all our knowledge at our fingertips and on our smartphones, what changes as we get older. So when we break it down into, again, normal aging versus what changes with normal aging versus declines in age that are not normal, we can also look at different aspects of memory and thinking. So, there are other things that the brain does other than short-term memory. So within memory, though, are autobiographical, so our knowledge of what happened to us over the last few weeks or months or our entire lifetime. Some of that may decline, so you might not remember details of things quite as well. Our general knowledge, as I said, generally stays stable, but very late in life that might decline a little bit. But procedural memory remains stable. Things like attention, that will generally stay stable for simple tasks, but when we have to focus on more things or there's complex attentional needs. So if you have children or grandchildren yelling in the background, it might be a bit more difficult to focus on things. Or when we have to do a divided attention task, so multitask or focus on multiple things, that gets a bit harder as we get older. For language, generally, again, vocabulary gets better with time, but things like, finding the right word to say, that tip of the tongue moment where you're trying to think of what that word, that will generally decline a little bit with age, and those events happen a bit more where you're searching for a word, but it shouldn't impair your ability to communicate with other people. Our visual spatial function, so that's navigation skills, recognizing objects and people. So those sort of things, like recognizing people or objects, landmarks, that doesn't generally change as we get older. But some more complex tasks, so putting together an IKEA furniture might be a little bit harder as we're older, and those things change. Executive function, that's problem solving, judgment, again, multitasking. That does generally get a bit slower with age, and we're not able to complete tasks as quickly as before. And the processing speed too, how quickly can you process information, that will decline. Things like behavior and personality, though, those remain fairly fixed. So with someone who's developing dementia, we don't see a change overnight to someone who develops Alzheimer's disease. It's a slow, progressive process, but then we want to kind of look at what are the differences with normal aging, mild cognitive impairment. So that means problems with memory and thinking that are more than expected for aging, and dementia. So that's when the problems start to impact your day-to-day life. So with normal aging, we might see small changes in memory and thinking, like I talked about before, but you're going to remain independent for your daily activities. So you're going to remember to pay your bills. You're not going to have a decline in your skills that you've learned before. Mild cognitive impairment, there's a more noticeable change that the person might see, or that some of their family members or loved ones might notice in memory and thinking, but you still remain independent for those day-to-day activities. Again, paying bills, using your computer, driving, things like that, but you might be a bit slower and have more difficulty with that. And then dementia, we start to see more significant problems with memory and thinking, and that's when diagnosis of dementia is really requiring assistance with daily activities. But there's not really a hard line between any of these, and it's a bit blurry, going from sometimes one category to another if people are declining over time. And mild cognitive impairment can be thought of as a risk factor for progressing to dementia. So as I said, dementia is a general term that means problems with memory and thinking that impair someone's ability to function in day-to-day life. And a lot of times people will ask about Alzheimer's. Well, Alzheimer's is a form of dementia. And actually looking at this slide just before I started presenting, that percentage there is probably a little higher than what actually we see. What we actually know now is the most common form of dementia is a mixed dementia. So that can be different things contributing to your dementia. So Alzheimer's would be one of those. Blood vessel or vascular disease is another thing. So that 60-80% for Alzheimer's is too high, but Alzheimer's disease is a specific brain disease that causes dementia. It's one cause of dementia, but not the only cause. And dementia is just a general term that can be caused by many different things. And this gives us an idea here. There's lots of different things that could be a factor there. So things like shrinkage of the brain due to a degenerative disease like Alzheimer's, but also changes in the wiring of the brain, this white matter that can be caused by things that affect blood vessel health, like diabetes, hypertension, high blood pressure, thyroid disease. Those things can all be other things that will impact and cause dementia. It's not just Alzheimer's disease. And so how do we diagnose dementia? So that's what I do generally day to day in the clinic here at the memory clinic. So what we want to see is there a pattern of changes in memory and thinking that are not expected because of aging? So again, is this a general pattern that we're seeing people are having changes that don't fit with those normal aging changes that I talked about? What aspects of memory and thinking, that's really important to find as well, because that'll help me and others to decide what might be the actual diagnosis and problem. So someone with Alzheimer's disease is more likely to have initial problems with short-term memory. They may repeat questions, forget details of conversations they've had, have problems with navigating in new places. But other types of dementia, they may affect things more like behavior or language early on. So that information can be really helpful to pinpoint a diagnosis. How long have the symptoms been there for? And has the progression been gradual? So if something was changing overnight, generally we'll see changes over months and years in someone developing Alzheimer's. If something was happening within weeks or days, that would make me think of another cause. And it's very important to get information from a knowledgeable informant. So a spouse, a family member, a friend, because the person themselves may not see the changes that are happening. And I always ask for that to would get that sort of collateral history when taking that history. It's important to look at family history. So having a family history does somewhat increase your risk of dementia. So that's important to know. Medical history, so we want to review for other conditions that could affect cognition. It's really important if we can find something that would be treatable, such as a vitamin deficiency or a thyroid abnormality, that we treat that. And other things like stroke or things that could impact memory. Medication, so some medications can impact cognition, even things we can get over the counter. So things like Gravol and Benadryl or medications with a PM tag on it, they cause us to be a bit drowsy, and that can affect people with memory symptoms more than others. It's not a cause of dementia necessarily, but it's important to think about and reduce the use of those medications. Social habits and history are important to know. So education level, higher levels of mental stimulation and mental activity during life are somewhat protective. Smoking and alcohol use can have effects on the brain and blood vessels. Physical activity and reduced social isolation and things like that are important to know about as well. So how are we going to diagnose this in the clinic? Well, there'll be a physical and neurological exam. Usually that's normal in someone with Alzheimer's, but we want to look for other abnormalities. We'll do cognitive testing. So that's generally the pen and paper tests that are given in an office. Laboratory tests, again, we're going to make sure there's not other medical conditions that could affect cognition, and then brain imaging. So you can see here the difference between someone who's cognitively normal versus mild cognitive impairment versus Alzheimer's. And the way I describe it is you want your brain to look a bit more full and like a grape and not as much like a walnut. So that's a sign of degeneration of brain cells in the brain and their connections. So now I'm going to shift a little bit and talk about maybe a new way, and a way that I'm looking at in my research to assess memory and functioning. So the conventional assessments that I just told you about, those rely on self-report. So we want someone to try to remember back over months and years about changes they've noticed in their memory and thinking, or from their loved one or spouse. It's an in-clinic assessment, which is convenient for me, but not for other people to come in necessarily. It's episodic and infrequent. So that means, you might come into the clinic every 3 months, 6 months, or a year, and we just get a snapshot of time of how you're doing at that time. It's a proxy measure of function. So we ask about how you're doing, but the pen and paper tests aren't telling me exactly how you're doing in terms of your day-to-day functioning, like using the computer, taking your medications. The memory tests are somewhat artificial. I'm sure nobody's come up to you on the street and said, give me 5 words and I'm going to come back in 10 minutes and ask you about those. And there can be some variability depending on when the test is given and who's giving the test. So I'm looking at ways to use technology to do a home-based assessment. And with that, we get objective data, meaning it's data that's collected by sensors and doesn't rely on memory or self-report. It's in real time and continuous, so we're getting lots of data points. It's maybe more ecologically valid. Again, it's telling me something about your day-to-day functioning that's more important to you, how you're doing day-to-day in your life. The system we use is as unobtrusive as possible, meaning we can monitor things and assess things, but people don't have to interact with that system, and you just go about your daily life, and we pick up changes that might represent changes in memory and thinking. We can actually compare you to you, so intra-individual changes, instead of comparing you to another group of your people around your age. And then there's high frequency data collection. We're getting a lot of information instead of just that snapshot every few months. So why might that be important? So here we can imagine we're measuring something like walking speed or doing a memory test. We're doing that, the first time I see you at 1 year and then 2 years from there. And for this person, it looks like they're declining over time, over those 2 years. But if I had continuous high frequency, lots of information, might see that, well, maybe we just got them on a good day and a bad day, but overall their trend is staying about the same. And then this person looks to be staying the same, but maybe with that more regular data collection, we're seeing that there's actually a decline. So we might be able to improve our accuracy to detect variability and changes over time in how people are doing. And so also, again, as I said, I want to look at an activity and compare you to yourself. So if I looked at my dunking ability compared to the roster from the Raptors, that's not going to be a very fair comparison. But maybe if I look at how I'm doing and then I want to see, am I changing over time? So this is an example of measuring walking speed in centimeters per second for one person. And this is a whole bunch of walks that were measured over time. So this person is generally walking at about 45 centimeters a second, whereas this person is a much quicker walker, walking around 70 centimeters per second. And so we want to be able to look and see, if this person drops down to 60 or 50, that's a big change for them. But for them, that might be actually better than normal. And so how do we do this? And so we're using a home system, and this is a technology system that's been developed in the Oregon Center for Aging and Technology, and it's been used in over 10 years in the homes of research volunteers. And right now it would be probably considered the world's largest database of naturalistic behaviors that tell us about how people are functioning in their lives. And so what we do is we have a home-based system here where different sensors are put in the home and monitoring data continuously. So this is just a little motion sensor that goes in each room of the home. And then we can see activity of people transitioning between rooms and general activity in the house. In some studies, we use a wearable. So this is like a Fitbit type wearable that gives me an idea of step count, sleep activity, and individuals that are wearing it. We get some data on pulse, heart rate, things like that, body composition from a smart scale. A medication tracker tells me that when these compartments are open, so we can track medication use on a daily basis. We use a pressure sensitive mat under the bed to look at bed occupancy, how much time people spend in bed, and also information about sleep. Things like computer activity. So not the details of what someone's doing, but how much time they spend on the computer, how many sessions per day. And also we use there are contact sensors on the door to measure when people are coming and going. And that can be a measure of social isolation, which is a risk factor for cognitive impairment. All of this is collected with a small little computer that's monitorless in the background of the home. Then the participant doesn't need to interact with the data collection. It's sent securely to data servers where we can then analyze this data and find things such as this. So a lot of these studies have been done with enrolling participants who had normal cognitive testing at baseline, but then over time, some people developed mild cognitive impairment and had a decline in their memory. And we can see that there were changes in their day-to-day activities picked up by this type of system. So in this case, we can see that people who remained cognitively intact stayed about the same in their computer use, whereas people who had mild cognitive impairment, they spent less time on their computer per each session, they had less days per month that they used the computer, and a more variable use of computer time. Also, medication changes in medication taking behavior can be seen. So this is from monitoring medication taken in an individual with Alzheimer's over a 7-month period. And this is the time of day they took the pill. So they should take it around 9 o'clock. And you can see at the start of the study, they were pretty good. Each black dot is taking the medication once per day. And they took it around 9 o'clock, but then later on, they started to miss some doses. And the other thing that we often notice is there's increased variability. So it's not only missing a dose, but sometimes you're taking it later than you normally would. Other things that have been picked up by the system is individuals that develop mild cognitive impairment were more likely to have a slower walking speed or have more variability in their walking speed. Differences in sleep can be seen in individuals with mild cognitive impairment versus those that are staying cognitively normal. And then social isolation. So people who have a higher rating of loneliness spend less time out of the home, but also people who spend less time out of the home are more likely to have a lower scores on cognitive testing, are more likely to have some cognitive impairment. Now, each of these measures of daily activity and physical health may not represent a decline due to dementia. So, but we're looking at finding patterns in all this information that give us an overall model of change in daily activities and functioning that are due to declines in memory and thinking. So changes in sleep could be due to many things. Changes in walking could be due to arthritis. But if we look at all of these changes together, we can start to detect a pattern or a group of changes that are associated with decline in memory and cognition. And so this research has applications for early detection of cognitive impairment. We might be able to pick up these changes earlier. We could follow changes over time and again compare you to you and people that are developing dementia or declining over time. Over time. And then we can maybe detect responses, either positive or negative, to medications to treat dementia, or also even to test new drugs that might be valuable for changes for detecting dementia or improving and treating Alzheimer's disease. And then one of the things we're doing here with our group at Briere is trying to also not only say there's maybe applications not only for detecting dementia, but also supporting aging in place and independence. And so we want to look at how this information can be used to help people stay in the place of their choosing. This could be, detecting changes in medication taking behavior, providing reminders for this medication, reminders for appointments, activities, monitoring for wandering behavior, which could be a danger later on in dementia. And so we're looking at developing this type of architect system and then using it to provide feedback to people in real time. And so that's an overview of the research we're doing. And, it's an exciting thing to see all the advances we're making and hopefully new ways that can complement the ways that I'm using in clinic with these pen and paper tests. So the next thing I'm going to do is just lead into Dr. Hakim's talk and say, so there's multiple different ideas now that we have about Alzheimer's. So as I said, it's not the 60 to 80% of dementia, it's usually a mixed dementia. So we have here the plaques and tangles that we normally see and associate with Alzheimer's disease, the amyloid plaques and tau tangles. And that causes the brain cells to die off over time. But it's not only that, we also are losing the connections that are between neurons and how they communicate together. So this would be a healthy brain cell. And then we're seeing one that would be affected in someone with Alzheimer's where there's loss of those connections. We can see over time that loss of connection and those shrinkage of the brain due to brain cells dying off from things like Alzheimer's. But people can grow old and have lots of amyloid plaques in their brain and may not have a diagnosis of dementia or cognitive impairment. And often that mixed dementia, so other things like blood vessel disease. So here we can see these white matter changes that signal damage to blood vessels over time and hardening of the arteries, narrowing of the arteries, inflammation, and those things work together with amyloid and tau, and that can cause dementia over time. And then we also see changes in the lymphatic pathway. This is kind of the sewer system that washes out toxins and things, and that is implicated in having an association or it's more dysfunctional in people with Alzheimer's disease. So if we look at this, well, what does this mean? Well, there's lots of changes that maybe we can improve over time. And so there's a recent study, I won't go into this in too much detail, that'll be more in the next talk, but there's a thought that, up to a third of dementia could be prevented by modifying certain risk factors, such as physical inactivity, social isolation, blood vessel risk factors. And if we focus on these things together, we might be able to make a big impact and reduce the incidence and the number of people developing dementia over time. So thank you very much for your time.
So thank you, Dr. Thomas, for a great talk. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. If you have questions for Dr. Thomas, we'll take them at the end and put them in the chat, and those will be answered at the end. So now I'd like to introduce our last speaker tonight, Dr. Antoine Hakim, who's going to talk about dementia prevention. So Dr. Hakim is a neurologist and senior scientist emeritus at the Ottawa Hospital. He's also a professor emeritus at the University of Ottawa. And we're very proud to say that Dr. Hakim is also the founding director of the University of Ottawa Brain and Mind Research Institute. Not only that, but Dr. Hakim was also the founding director and CEO of the Canadian Stroke Network. And this stroke network that was actually initiated by Dr. Hakim changed the entire treatment strategy for stroke patients. And today, stroke survivors have a much brighter outlook on life. And for his work with the Canadian Stroke Network, Dr. Hakim received many awards, and I won't go through them all, but he received the Canada Gairdner-Whitman Award, and he also received the Officer of the Order of Canada. And so from his studies and the work of others, Dr. Hakim came to realize that many forms of dementia have the potential to be prevented. And he wrote a book on the subject entitled Save Your Mind, 7 Ways to Prevent Dementia. And this is what he's going to talk to us about today. So welcome, Dr. Hakim. You're good to go.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you very much for this lovely introduction. And I'm delighted to be talking to you about aging and cognitive impairment and dementia. And I basically have 3 messages for you. Dementia does not have to accompany old age. We know of many individuals who have lived into their 90s and even beyond with absolutely intact memory function. That's the first message. It's not written that you have to become demented as you get older. The second message is that only one person can decide how much risk for dementia you will have. And guess what? That person is you. And the third message is, don't wait until your memory begins to weaken to apply some of the advice I'm going to give you today. The earlier you start, the more protected you are. And I even recommend, if there are any teenagers watching us today, or if you know of any, to please pass on the messages that I'm going to give you about how you protect your brain. So let's get into the meat of the talk, and I'll try to run through this quickly. I will not read every point on every slide. I will just point the ones that are important. So in this slide, it says that currently almost 1 million Canadians are cognitively impaired. But 10 years from now, there will be 2.4 million Canadians suffering from dementia. And by 20 years from now, the cost of managing dementia alone will exceed our entire current total healthcare budget. This is a very expensive problem for society to deal with. So there are many types of dementia, but patients, this is an important message. Point number 2, patients may have had a decade or more of brain cells being destroyed before symptoms appear. And that's why you have to protect yourself against dementia a lot sooner than the onset of the problems that you may have with memory. Dr. Thomas talked about the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Mr. Alzheimer described 2 kinds of changes in the brain, which we have assumed all this time to be, in fact, the causes of dementia, which is that he described these plaques and tangles, and he said, oh, these are proteins that are accumulating in the brain, and they are just gunking the brain up, and if we could only get rid of them, the dementia would improve. And that has turned out to be not the case. Drug companies have spent billions of dollars testing drugs that remove these proteins and have done so successfully without any improvement in the patient's cognitive function. So we have been forced to rethink Alzheimer's disease and dementia in ways that have, in fact, improved our understanding very significantly. So currently, there is no cure for dementia, and there is no drug to be taken to improve the memory function. The first time we began to think that maybe there was more to the story than just these plaques and tangles was the study that looked at the entire body and the brains of people who had died with a diagnosis of dementia. And they discovered that 80% of them had, in addition to Alzheimer's disease, a vascular abnormality, a problem with the blood supply, not just to the brain, but perhaps in other parts of the body as well. So all of a sudden, we began to think that any condition that would reduce blood flow to the brain will cause cognitive difficulty and then dementia. And we now recognize that vascular risk factors are an important, perhaps predominant cause of dementia. Here is a very important study that showed up about 4 years ago, in which they looked at patients doing multiple determinations, starting with healthy controls, and then looked at the same people as they developed early mild cognitive impairment, then late mild cognitive impairment, then late onset Alzheimer's disease. And they measured blood flow to the brain, brain glucose utilization, cognitive determinations of how well is the brain working. And when they looked at all of this put together and those proteins that we've talked about that accumulate in the brain and give plaques and tangles, they came to one amazing conclusion. There is a decline in the cerebral blood flow as the very first signal that something terrible is about to happen, long before the patient is aware of any cognitive difficulty. So we have looked at this and have developed 7 rules, as Dr. Slack has mentioned, that I will go over with you. And these 7 rules mentioned quickly are: number 1, build a reserve in your brain that will protect you as time goes on. And we'll talk about how we do that. Don't let your brain get injured in any way. Monitor and tame your vascular risk factors, especially blood pressure. Avoid obesity. Obesity is considered to be a very significant risk factor for cognitive impairment and dementia. Maintain an active lifestyle. You must sleep enough and have a positive attitude. So let me go into some of these details. But the important thing to remember is that for most of us, dementia is a consequence of vascular disease. And that gives you the power to change the course of your life and its interaction with dementia. So build cognitive reserve. What is that? How did we? That's an ability for your brain to overcome the conditions that will later on come on in life that will decrease your memory function. And cognitive reserve can only be increased through persistent and varied cognitive activation. What are we talking about? How did we even come up with this concept? The cognitive reserve can only be increased through persistent and varied cognitive activation. So don't do Sudoku all day long. That's not going to help your cognitive reserve, because the brain wants variety and wants persistence. Stimulate your brain's cognitive functions by writing, reading, memorizing, calculating, planning, mapping, joining a choir. Music puts an incredible demand on your brain, and that will increase your cognitive function, your cognitive reserve. A few years ago, in fact, more than 20 years ago, 102 sisters generously offered that they be examined before they died in terms of how much cognitive function did they have, and allowed their brains to be looked at after they died. And it was very interesting that 61 brains had these plaques and tangles in them, but only 35 of those nuns, of those 61 individuals had showed any trouble with memory function while they were alive. So we know that you can overcome the problems that occur in the brain with the accumulation of these plaques and tangles. Here is another example that is more recent. If you wanted to become a taxi driver in London, England, you have to study every road, every alleyway, every street in London and take repeated exams. And those take 4 years for you to get your license to drive a taxi. And only when you have passed all of your exams, over 4 years of memorizing, will you then get your driver's license. And so somebody said, hey, wait a minute, can I get a CT scan of the brains of those individuals who had passed their exams and compare them to the brains of the individuals who had failed their exams? And the conclusion was very striking. Those who had passed their exams, are you ready? Had a bigger brain than those who had failed their exams. And so we know that we can influence the size of our brain, and that correlates with memory function. A very major impact on your memory function is suffering a stroke, because it is now possible to both prevent strokes and treat them. Cognitive decline is present in 61% of all patients who suffer strokes within a period of 3 months. Here's what happens when a stroke is suffered by a brain and it is not prevented or treated. There is a major area of damage that occurs in the brain, and that increases the risk for cognitive impairment, for dementia. And so how do you tell if someone is having a stroke? Because that it's very important to then immediately react by calling 911. Usually what happens is someone you're sitting with, you'll notice that they're mumbling or that their face is drooping. If their face is drooping, ask them to put their arms in front of them. And if one arm is drooping compared to the other that they can hold, and their speech is slurred, call 911 and tell them that you think your friend is having a stroke. The ambulance will come, immediately take the patient to the correct hospital, because not all hospitals are set up to take care of this problem. And that's why you shouldn't take the patient yourself in the car and take them to an emergency room. And there, a CT scan will be done very quickly, and a drug and perhaps other procedures will be given to interrupt the process of the brain suffering a stroke. Unfortunately, we have discovered also something called covert strokes, are ones that occur in the brain. They're so small that the patient is not aware of them. And these occur quite frequently, and they look like this: small little white spots on the MRI. These are tiny covert strokes. When each one happened, the patient didn't feel anything. So how do we prevent these from happening? Well, the risk factors for stroke are listed. The important ones are here on the left-hand side: high blood pressure, cigarette smoking, diabetes that is not treated, irregular heart rhythm that is not treated, high cholesterol that is not treated, sedentary existence, an unhealthy diet, and previous history of stroke. These are the risk factors that must be prevented if you want to protect your brain against stroke. Let's look at an important one, and that is controlling your blood pressure. Here is a terrible statement. For each 1 millimeter of blood pressure increase above normal, and we'll define what that is, you will increase your risk for late life cognitive trouble by approximately 1%. And we have recent studies that show that when you are completely at rest, you are not in your doctor's office, you're in your own home. You're completely at rest and you're not being stressed, and you measure your blood pressure. The ideal number we are looking for, the higher, there are two numbers. The higher number should be 120. If it is 124, like is shown on this slide, it is not the end of the world, but we don't want it to get to be to 135 or 140 when you're completely at rest. And the reason for that, and so the advice I give is get yourself a blood pressure cuff and learn how to use it at home. And we know that with a systolic blood pressure that is intensively controlled, you can reduce your risk for dementia. So the next point I want to talk about is our dietary habits and our weight. And it's very important for you to understand from me that this is not about body shaming. This is not about criticizing people who are obese. This is simply about talking about obesity as being a condition that impacts your brain. Very recently, we have come to, unfortunately, realize that approximately 1/3 of our children between the age of 5 and 19 are obese, and 6% of the children who are under the age of 5 are also overweight or obese. Being overweight independently increases the risk of dementia. In participants, we observed a significant increase of abdominal visceral fat is associated with reduced total brain volume. That fat that we accumulate around our abdomen isn't inert material. It's putting out chemicals, inflammatory chemicals that go to the brain and poison it. And so we recommend strongly that subjects should adhere to the Mediterranean diet. If you do so, you have 1/3 reduction in your risk for cognitive trouble. Notice that this doesn't have a lot of meat, and it is mostly fruits and vegetables and fish. Obesity reprograms the brain to prefer high-calorie diets. The next very important thing to tell you is that we're all busy people, but please, whatever you do, do not double task eating. Focus on what you're eating and don't do something else while you're eating. I see that in the cafeteria of the hospital all the time. But here's the reason why we say that. If you're distracted while you're eating, you will not remember what you ate very clearly. You will feel less full after you've eaten while distracted, and you will double down on dessert afterwards. So please eat while you're eating. Focus on what you're doing with your food and nothing else. The next item is the role of physical activity. It's very important to recognize that when you do physical activity, your brain gets the message. You increase blood flow to the brain, and physical activity allows the brain to function better, even when there are early signs inside your brain of early aging. So the recommendation is get out of breath once or twice a day because you're doing something that is active. Your brain needs a minimum of 1 hour per week of moderate effort, but thrives on 30 minutes of some kind of physical activity every day. Here are some exercise snacks. Take the stairs, avoid the elevator for less than 4 floors. Park away from the entrance of the shopping center and jog to the door. I see people drive around for a long time just to find a spot to park their car that is close to the door. Hey, go away where there is lots of parking room away from the door and walk quickly to the door. Disconnect from your computer if you're somebody who's connected to the computer every hour or so for 5 minutes and go for a quick jog, a quick walk. If you take your dog for a walk, how about jogging your dog? Now here is 2 studs who are missing an opportunity for an exercise snack. They're taking the escalator instead of taking the stairs. The value of adequate sleep is another one of my recommendations to you. Sleep is when whatever you've learned during the day becomes consolidated. And sleep is the time when your brain is repairing itself from the damage that may have occurred during the day. Your brain is revved up all the time and accumulates breakdown products that sit in the brain, and the only time they get cleaned up, these toxic molecules get only cleaned up while you're sleeping. And so it's very important to understand that sleep deprivation damages the brain, accelerates its shrinkage, and has a negative impact on executive function. My last point is to emphasize the importance of mental health for memory function. Of course, this picture was taken before we all had to wear masks, but socialize and feel useful. Loneliness and depression can harm your memory function. In fact, when the impact on the brain was compared between those who suffer from depression and those who suffer from high blood pressure, it was basically the same impact. Being depressed and maintaining that state for a long time is as damaging to the brain as high blood pressure that is maintained for a long time. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hakim, for a very inspiring talk. And I'm sure now we can all make healthy lifestyle choices, like not multitask eating. That's one example. So now to lead our question period and panel discussion, I'd like to introduce Dean Henderson, who's the Director of Client Experience and Education at the Dementia Society of Ottawa and Renfrew County. And the Dementia Society provides tremendous support for people living with dementia, for families and their caregivers. So thank you so much for being with us today, Dean.
Thank you for having me. What a wonderful discussion that we had here. And I've got lots of questions ready for the speakers. So for all those participants, those 244 of you, if you would continue to type your questions in the chat function, I will do my best to have them answered for you. But first and foremost, the first question, Ruth, is actually for you. And is this recorded? Some people had to leave and they were just wondering if they would have access to being recorded.
Yes, this is being recorded and it's going to appear on the website next week. So every session for Brain Health Awareness Week will be on our website.
Amazing. Sorry to put you on the spot there.
No.
Okay. So the last few questions came in were around diet. So I'm looking at you, Dr. Hakim, just to help kick us off here. It is just, if I could summarize the few questions here, is there any type of diet particularly bad for dementia? And is there a relationship between some countries and their diet and the amount of dementia?
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, there is. We know that countries that favor the Mediterranean diet have a lower dementia incidence. And the diet items that you need to avoid are salt, because that increases your blood pressure. You need to cut down on fat. I spend time during the summer in PEI, not this summer, but there is an ice cream joint that we go to. And the last time I was there, there was this big sign that said, "Our ice cream now has bacon in it." And I thought to myself, oh my God, you know, so I went to the window and I said, "Why are you putting bacon in ice cream?" And the lady said, "Sir, you would be amazed at how popular it is." So these are the awful habits that we are getting into, where there is fat and salt and sugar in everything that we eat. So we have to be extremely careful about our diet. And Dr. Ismail talked about the gut microbiome. The gut microbiome is very unhealthy when we are feeding ourselves the fat and the sugar and the salt that, you know, and red meat. I mean, daily red meat is not advisable. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hakim. The other question is, we'll leave it and you guys could share it on another time, but it's your favorite recipe books or websites related to eating well and dementia. But I think you answered that question and already. So the next question is to Dr. Thomas, and it really was looking at your the study that you've been working on, and thinking about COVID right now and how virtual socialization, like how you could integrate that into how you're monitoring and the health of people living. Living. So any thoughts around that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so I would say right now, you know, the system that we're using is doing a lot of assessment and evaluation and monitoring of people. But actually one of the projects we're hoping to look at did involve a component where within this feedback system, you might involve a sort of smart screen speaker that would allow not only for you to maybe communicate with your health professional, but also from a sort of virtual community, which is so much more important with all these restrictions and issues related to COVID. So that would be a really interesting part to add to the study, and I think that would provide benefit as well. Socializing in person is optimal, but if we're able to provide a virtual component to that, that could be beneficial for some people.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. And just while your mic is unmuted, the other question that came in for a few people is just if you're worried, if you're listening here and you're worried about your own memory, what should people do, or who should they go and talk to?
Yeah. So I think the best place to start is to talk to your family doctor. There are lots of little tests and things online, but I wouldn't say there's anything that's really truly validated. And the best thing is to get an assessment by a medical professional. I would start with talking to your family doctor, bring up your concerns. As I talked about, the importance of bringing a friend or family member or spouse so they can provide their impression of how things are. And if they've noticed any changes is extremely important. And then that the family physician can start with an assessment and then consider, do they need to do any other testing? Do they need to be referred to a specialty center?
Thank you. And Dr. Ismail, the questions, a few kind of related questions that have come in around stress and memory and our ability to learn. So the first part is, how does stress impact our memory and ability to learn? Particularly, I think everyone's anxiety levels are a little bit higher than they usually are, given the situation that we're all in with COVID-19.
A very good question. There's two kinds of stressors. There is acute stress, and then there is chronic stress. So acute stress is that short-lasting stress that we get, like when we have a deadline coming up, or something we need to finish by a certain date. And that acute stress is actually good. It allows us to concentrate, to focus, and facilitates memory and learning and attention, gets us focused and pumped and ready to do the activity that we need to do. The problem is when we have chronic stress, because that stress lasts for a long time. And what we see is that when stress is long lasting, it not only activates our stress system, but also activates our immune system. And then with that, we get inflammation in our body, and then neuroinflammation in our brain. And that's what's not good. So chronic stress, which is what we're experiencing right now during the pandemic, is not good. And so we have to kind of try to bring our stress levels down, try to manage our stress levels while doing a number of different activities. It depends from person to person. Sometimes meditation, yoga, physical activity, all these that Dr. Hakim also mentioned can help cognition and dementia. So all these activities that can also help us reduce stress is going to be highly beneficial during this time.
Thank you. I took Dr. Hakim's advice, and I've ordered blood pressure monitoring systems for everyone in my family. That is their holiday gift this year. So if anyone else is looking for ideas, there you go. It's something easy, and it's you're saving their lives. Dr. Hakim, the next one is for you. And I would say everyone would feel free to answer, but it's around sleep and the importance of sleep. So, you know, I try really hard to sleep, but I struggle at it. Should I take a sleeping aid if I'm only sleeping 3 to 4 hours a night to try and avoid dementia?
Well, so my answer to that question is first of all, we say that 7 hours of sleep per day is really what you should aim for. And you will be amazed if you are able to sleep 7 hours, how much clearer your thinking is and how much better your ability to function cognitively is compared to sleeping less than that. As we get older, we get up at night to go to the bathroom, sometimes 2 times, sometimes 3 times. All of that is interrupting your sleep. And so it's very important to put in the equation of sleep whatever you need to do, whether it is a siesta in the afternoon or going to bed a little earlier or staying in bed a little later, that it should add up to about 7 hours. No, 3, 4, 5 hours, that is not going to help you function cognitively normally. And so it's very important. There are all kinds of tricks, you know, don't drink that cup of coffee before you go to bed. Try to develop a routine around your house before you go to bed so that your brain says, oh, I see. She is getting ready to go to bed because this is the same routine. She first locks the front door, then locks the back door, then locks the, you know. So there are tricks that you can use to help you sleep better. If you are someone who gets up to go to the bathroom 2 or 3 times a night, then your last sip of anything to drink should be 2 hours to 3 hours before you go to bed. And that's my advice. 7 hours is important.
Thank you. I'm having a tough time getting to all these questions. There's a lot of them coming in. Dr. Thomas, is there anyone in Ottawa or in this region that is being monitored by your research?
Yeah, so currently we have a few homes that are being monitored. They were obviously, we got those systems installed before the pandemic. So you know, like everything that's COVID's affected our research. So it has limited our ability to look at installing more of these systems. But we've been able to continue on with the participants that are already enrolled. And actually we are looking now at ways to do remote installation. So that's going to be a new sort of research project to look at. We send someone sort of a smart home in a box and help them to set it up and still get a good setup for data collection and the monitoring system that we need.
Awesome. And I guess I'll leave this open to everyone as well. If you're a caregiver, when you're going to face chronic high stress for years, supporting someone living with dementia, is there anything else that you should do to help reduce your chances of developing dementia?
Well, can you hear me? Yeah. So it's Dr. Hakim. I think there is always a concern if your mom or your dad develop dementia that you will develop that there's something genetic that will make your chances of becoming demented higher. And so let's just say a couple of things. Genetically inherited dementias, two things, are likely to impact the individual earlier in their 50s and 60s, earlier than the dementia that is not genetically inherited. Secondly, please remember the few things that, so if you've lived to be 65 without any memory problems, it is unlikely that you have inherited a genetically inherited variety of Alzheimer's disease and dementia. From then on, the 7 rules that we have suggested is really a consolidation of all kinds of information that has come our way. And so start now. Don't wait till you start having memory problems before you apply those rules. And that's my advice.
I'll just, Dean, I'll give a great plug for your organization, I would say. So if you're a caregiver who's finding you're having a difficult time, and it is a very difficult position to be in, and caregivers do have, unfortunately, higher rates of medical illness and stress and depression and mental health issues because of their role. But reach out as much as you can for help. And so the Dementia Society is an incredible organization. I know they help a lot of the caregivers of my patients and their family and the patients themselves. So try to find whatever help you can and to go along with you in that journey.
Thank you, Dr. Hakim. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Dr. Ismail, one of the first questions that came up when you were presenting was just a question around how disabilities affect the brain as we get older, and specifically, the question is around ADHD. So just wondering if you had any comments there. It was a more general question, but I thought I'd get to that.
Yeah, so there are definitely certain health factors that can increase the risk for cognitive decline. And we know of some, and we are continuing to discover as we go. But as Dr. Hakim mentioned, like obesity is one of them, high blood pressure is another one, diabetes is another one. So we know a lot more about metabolic disorders that do link to dementia and cognitive decline. We also know about some mental health problems like depression and anxiety that can be also predisposing factors. And so collectively, when we think about it, these are all disorders that the way I see it, and my colleagues can jump in as well, but the way that I see it is that it's all disorders that are related around neuroinflammation in the brain. And it seems to be particularly also neuroinflammation during critical period of developments when the brain is still being remodeled and being reorganized and so on, that can set like a stage for a predisposition later in life, you know. So absolutely, there are some disorders that are going to increase our likelihood of developing cognitive issues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm not, we have time for just one more question here. Let me randomly pick one here. There's some great questions coming in. I guess just more onto the topic of sleep here. And the question is about, you know, does the type of sleep matter in terms of having that deep sleep versus a very light sleeper? Yeah. Is there any comments there on the type of sleep and what is and how that influences our brain?
I mean, maybe I'll take a crack at it. When we sleep, there are different stages of sleep that we go through. Basically, we have very little control over these different stages of sleep. Your brain is going to travel through these different stages as you continue to sleep. You know, if you're somebody who has to get up to go to the bathroom a lot, then it depends when that bladder wakes you up. You may find yourself waking up in the middle of a dream and you realize, oh, I'm not really dreaming, I'm awake and I need to go to the bathroom. It's very important to try to let the brain go through the different stages of sleep one after the other, because that continuity is in fact what defines adequate sleep. Again, you have no control over what stage of sleep you're in. All we know is that the advice is get 7 hours of sleep, hopefully uninterrupted, but if it's interrupted, still try to add up to 7 hours. I don't know if Neil or Nafissa have any additional modulations on this advice.
I can add to that. So especially with the current context that we're in, we're seeing that a lot of people have reported having disrupted sleep, lots of light sleep, or waking up with very vivid dreams. And all that is related to the stress that they are experiencing during the day. So as my colleagues, Dr. Hakim and Dr. Thomas have mentioned, getting into good habits, you know, so trying to really reduce that cortisol level, that stress level that you are experiencing before bedtime. One source of stress is the screen too. So we're at home, we're always on our screen trying to get information about what's happening with the pandemic. That's a big stressor. So we want to try to not do that maybe 2 hours before we go to bed so we can really unwind and then go to bed being more calm and then have better quality sleep and be able to go through all these stages of sleep cycle.
And if you're somebody who is used to going to bed with your iPhone, stop it. If you put it outside, leave it outside. If you're somebody who has a TV screen inside your bedroom, take it out. And so these are all the things that can help you sleep better.
Love it. Well, thank you, everyone, for those wonderful questions. And thank you to our panel of speakers here for a great talk. I am not sure if I'm passing this off to Ruth. I believe I am. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dean. That was a great panel discussion. And I'd like to thank all our speakers today for a great session. I'd like to thank our partner institutions for working with us, and also the Brain and Mind team. And if you would like to support research at the University of Ottawa Brain and Mind Research Institute, you can go to the link on our website. The power for change is yours. And if you would like more information or attend future events, also go to the Brain and Mind website, follow us on Facebook or on Twitter. And I hope you can join us for tomorrow's event, where our Parkinson's team will present Solving the Parkinson's Disease Puzzle. So again, thank you so much, everyone, for being with us tonight. And hopefully we'll see you tomorrow.